Welcome back to the deep dive. Today isn't about casual learning. We are definitely not just browsing the latest headlines or skimming abstracts.
No.
We are preparing for war, specifically the battleground that is the Gujarat University MD anesthesiology exams.
The Respiratory Physiology Viva. It's always the gatekeeper.
It really is. I was looking at the syllabus last night, and honestly, I felt that familiar pit in my stomach. You know the one?
I do.
The fear of standing in front of that whiteboard, marker in hand, 3 senior professors just staring at you over their glasses, and being asked to draw the carbon dioxide dissociation curve. It feels like the ultimate trap.
It is a rite of passage, for sure. But that anxiety, it usually comes from a lack of structure. I find students memorize the lines on the graph, but they don't understand the story behind the lines.
Right.
Our job today is to give you that narrative so you can walk into that exam room, not just hoping to survive, but ready to explain it better than the examiner.
That is a bold promise. We're aiming for gold medal answers today, then.
Absolutely. We are aiming for the distinction level. We need to move beyond the MBBS level of CO2 as a waste gas and get into the MD level of CO2 as the master regulator of homeostasis.
Okay. And to get there, I see we have pulled the heavy artillery. I see Miller's Anesthesia and Morgan and McHale on the desk for the clinical side.
Of course.
You've got Guyton open for the raw physiology and Yao and Artuzio for the more problem-based stuff.
And don't forget these. We also have scripts from Dr. Podcast and the DNB questions banks. These are great because they really help frame the wording.
Ah, that's key.
Knowing the physiology is one thing. Saying it succinctly while under pressure is a completely different skill.
Okay, the roadmap. We are going to break this down into 6 main parts, from the introduction all the way to exam integration at the end.
Sounds good.
So part A is our framing. Why does this even matter? Part B is the physics and transport the curve itself. Part C is the controller, how the brain reads the map. Part D is where we as anesthetists mess it all up.
How anesthetics sabotage the system.
Yes. Part E is clinical application. And then part F is how to actually pass the exam.
Let's get to it.
Part A, introduction and exam framing. Let's start with the absolute basics. Why CO2? I mean, in the ICU and the OR, we seem obsessed with oxygen saturation. The pulse oximeter is like the heartbeat of the room. But you're arguing that carbon dioxide is actually the master regulator.
Think about it this way. Hypoxia kills you, yes, of course. But the body is surprisingly tolerant of mild hypoxia. It has all these compensatory mechanisms. But CO2 is the minute-to-minute driver of your entire existence.
Minute-to-minute.
In the immediate intraoperative period, and certainly in the recovery room, CO2 is often more critical because it is the primary driver of ventilation. Yao and Artuzio makes this comparison that I think floors most residents when they first hear it. It's about body stores.
Okay, I remember this vaguely. We don't store much oxygen at all, right?
Almost none.
Huh.
In a functional residual capacity of a normal adult, plus what's bound to hemoglobin, you have maybe 1.5 liters of oxygen total.
That's it?
That's it. If you stop breathing, you burn through that in minutes. That's your entire buffer, 1.5 liters.
It's tiny.
Now, compare that to carbon dioxide. The body stores approximately 120 liters of CO2.
120? That's massive. That's 80 times the oxygen storage. Where are we hiding 120 liters of gas?
It's not all gas, and that's the key. Most of it is stored in the bone as carbonate and bicarbonate. It's a very slow release compartment.
Okay.
But there's a substantial amount dissolved in soft tissues and blood. This massive reservoir means CO2 is not just a waste product we are trying to exhale. It is the fundamental component of our acid-based buffering system. As O's Intensive Care points out, your POCO2 is the primary determinant of your pH.
So when the examiner asks a 20-mark question on CO2 transport, they aren't just checking if you know how we breathe.
Yeah.
They are checking if you understand how we stay alive chemically.
Correct. They want to see linkage. Can you link the shape of the curve, the physics, to the fact that a patient with COPD behaves differently than a 20-year-old athlete? That is the linkage requirement.
And these questions appear frequently.
Constantly. You'll get long questions like, describe CO2 transport and the factors affecting it. You'll get short notes on the Haldane effect or the apneic threshold. And in the Viva, you will almost certainly be handed a marker and asked to draw the ventilatory response curve.
Okay, let's get into the weeds then. Part B, the CO2 dissociation curve. This is absolutely essential territory. If I'm standing at the whiteboard, I draw my axis. X-axis is partial pressure PCO2, Y-axis is content. What is the very first mistake candidates make here?
They draw a sigmoid curve. They draw an S shape because their muscle memory is just so trained on the oxygen dissociation curve.
But the CO2 curve isn't sigmoid.
No. Within the physiological range, let's say a PCO2 between 40 and 50 millimeters of mercury, the CO2 curve is substantially linear. Morgan and Mikhail calls it pseudolinear or quasi-linear.
Why does that shape matter clinically? I mean, who cares if it's straight or curved?
It matters immensely.
Yeah.
Oxygen has a ceiling, right?
Yeah.
Once your hemoglobin is 100% saturated, you can give 100% FiO2, hyperbaric oxygen, whatever you want. You are barely adding any more oxygen content to the blood. You've hit the plateau.
Right, the top of the S.
The CO2 curve has no plateau in the clinical range. It's a straight line going up. That means if your PCO2 rises, your blood just keeps carrying more and more and more CO2.
Oh.
Conversely, and this is the key for neuroanesthesia, if you hyperventilate, you can drive the CO2 content down linearly. You can effectively empty the tank. You cannot do that with oxygen content.
That is a powerful distinction. Now, that the exam demands we mark two specific points on this line, the arterial and the venous point.
You have to know these numbers cold.
Yeah.
The arterial point is at a PCO2 of 40 mmHg. The content there is about 48 ml per dl.
40 ml, okay. And the venous point?
Venous blood has picked up the waste. So the PCO2 is about 45 to 46 mmHg. The content rises to about 52 ml per dl.
Wait, hold on. Look at those pressure numbers. 40 arterial, 46 venous. That's a gradient of only 6 mmHg.
Tiny, isn't it? Compare that to oxygen, where the gradient is from 100 mmHg down to 40, a 60 mmHg drop.
How does the body move such a massive volume of waste gas, what was it, 4 ml per dl per cycle, with such a pathetic pressure gradient?
That is the beautiful efficiency of the CO2 solubility and transport system. CO2 is incredibly soluble, something like 20 times more soluble than oxygen. It diffuses like a ghost through membranes. It doesn't need a high-pressure gradient to move.
So it's all about solubility.
Right. Guyton emphasizes this specifically, that narrow 6 mmHg window handles the entire metabolic output of the body. It's remarkable.
Let's break down that transport then. We have the three buckets: dissolved, bicarbonate, and carbamino. Miller gives us the percentages. Walk me through the life of a CO2 molecule leaving a muscle cell.
Okay, so a CO2 molecule leaves the muscle, crosses the interstitial fluid, and enters the plasma. A small amount just stays there, about 5 to 10%. That's the dissolved fraction. It just follows Henry's law, simple physics.
Then the rest enters the red blood cell, the RBC.
Right, and this is where the magic happens. Inside the RBC, there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase.
The catalyst.
And it's an incredibly fast enzyme. It takes CO2 and water and just smashes them together to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. That acid is unstable, so it instantly dissociates into a hydrogen ion, H+, and bicarbonate, HCO3-.
So now we have bicarbonate trapped inside the red cell.
But it doesn't stay there. Bicarbonate is the primary transport form. We're talking 70 to 90% of all CO2 travels as bicarbonate. It diffuses out of the red cell back into the plasma.
But wait, bicarbonate is negatively charged. If you just start dumping negative charges out of the cell, you're going to wreck the membrane potential.
Exactly. Electrical neutrality must be maintained. So as the negative bicarbonate leaves, a negative chloride ion moves in to take its place.
The chloride shift.
Or, if you want to sound really smart and nod to the history of physiology, you can call it the Hamburger phenomenon.
I always love that name. So the vast majority of CO2 is actually floating around in the plasma as bicarbonate, but it had to be processed inside the RBC first.
That's the key.
What about the leftovers, the Carbamino compounds?
This is the remaining 20 to 30%. CO2 binds directly to proteins. Mostly, it binds to hemoglobin.
Does it bind to the same spot as oxygen? On the heme?
No, and that is a critical Viva point. Oxygen binds to the heme iron. CO2 binds to the terminal amino groups on the globin chains. They have different seats on the bus, so to speak.
But, and here's the segue to the most dreaded concept, even though they sit in different seats, they still annoy each other.
That's a perfect description. They affect the conformation of the hemoglobin molecule. This brings us directly to the Haldane effect.
Okay, hold on. Before we define it, I need a mnemonic. I always confuse Haldane and Bohr.
Everyone does. Here is the Doctor Podcast trick, and it's a lifesaver. Bohr starts with B. B is for breathing at the tissues. The Bohr effect explains how CO2 and acid help release oxygen to the tissues.
B for breathing at tissues, release of oxygen. Got it.
Haldane starts with H. H is for hemoglobin holding CO2. The Haldane effect explains how oxygen affects the loading and unloading of CO2.
H for hemoglobin holding CO2. Okay. That helps. So define the Haldane effect for the examiner.
The elevator pitch is, deoxygenated blood can carry more CO2 than oxygenated blood.
Simple enough. But Guyton goes deeper. Why? Why does stripping oxygen off hemoglobin suddenly make it want to hold more CO2?
It's all about structural chemistry. When hemoglobin is oxygenated in its R state, it acts as a stronger acid. It doesn't really want to bind hydrogen ions. But when it becomes deoxygenated, the T state, it changes shape. It becomes a better base.
And a better base binds H+ ions more avidly.
Exactly. Specifically, the histidine residues in the globin chain have an imidazole group that becomes more basic, so it just mops up the H+ ions floating around. Now go back to our equation. CO2 plus water gives you H+ and bicarbonate. If deoxyhemoglobin removed the H+, it pulls that whole equation to the right, Le Chatelier's principle.
It drives the reaction forward.
Precisely. By removing one of the products, the H+, deoxy-HB forces the production of more bicarbonate. That accounts for the majority of the Haldane effect. The second part is that the deoxy state also binds directly to CO2, forming Carbamino compounds more easily. It's a double whammy.
So structurally, deoxy-HB is just a better CO2 sponge.
That's a great way to put it. And this doubles the efficiency of CO2 transport. Think about what happens in the lungs. You breathe in oxygen. Your HB becomes oxygenated. Suddenly, the Haldane effect reverses. The HB becomes a strong acid. It kicks off the H+, it kicks off the direct-bound CO2, and you exhale it all. It is a perfectly timed ejection system.
That is elegant. So if I'm drawing this on the curve, the Haldane effect isn't just a point. It actually shifts the whole line.
Correct. You should draw two separate lines. If your patient is hypoxic, meaning low O2 and more deoxy-HB, the CO2 curve shifts up. It holds more CO2 for any given PCO2.
And if they're hyperoxic,
the curve shifts down.
Okay. Are there other factors that can shift this curve?
Oh, yes. Temperature is a big one. Hypothermia shifts the curve to the left.
Why?
Solubility. It's basic physics. Gases dissolve better in cold liquids. Cold blood holds more CO2. This is what leads to the whole pH stat versus alpha stat debate in cardiac bypass. But for the basic physiology exam, just remember, hypothermia equals left shift equals higher content.
And what about something like metabolic acidosis?
Well, acidosis depletes your bicarbonate buffer. If you have low bicarbonate stores to begin with, your total CO2 content for any given PCO2 drops, so the curve shifts downward.
Got it. Okay, I think we have the transport part down. Let's move to part C, the ventilatory response. This is the control system. We've got the gas in the blood. Now, how does the brain know what to do with it?
This is where we talk about the controller in the brain. The respiratory center, located in the medulla, and the pons.
And we have sensors feeding it information, central and peripheral. Let's start central. These are on the ventral surface of the medulla. What exactly are they tasting?
This is one of the trickiest questions in the Viva, the examiner will ask. Does CO2 stimulate the central chemoreceptors?
Yeah, I don't want to say yes.
The correct answer is yes, but indirectly. The sensors themselves actually detect hydrogen ions, H+. They are, in essence, pH detectors.
But wait, H+ ions are charged? They can't cross the blood-brain barrier, the BBB?
Correct, and that's the beautiful part of the design. If you inject metabolic acid, like lactic acid, into the blood, breathing doesn't change much immediately because that acid is blocked by the BBB. But CO2 is a gas. It's lipid-soluble. It goes right through the barrier into the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF.
So CO2 sneaks in.
Once it's in the CSF, it finds water. And just like in the red cell, it turns into carbonic acid, and then it dissociates into H+. So the sensor tastes the H+, but that H+ was made locally from the CO2 that just crossed over.
That distinction is absolutely vital. Why does the CSF react so dramatically to this?
Because CSF is very poor in protein. Blood has hemoglobin and albumin to buffer any acid changes. CSF has almost nothing. It is a completely unbuffered environment. So even a tiny rise in CO2 causes a massive drop in CSF pH. That makes the system exquisitely sensitive.
And that's why it's called minute-to-minute regulation.
Exactly that.
But this system resets, doesn't it? In patients with COPD, for example.
It does. If you have chronically high CO2 for, say, 24 to 48 hours, the kidneys start to compensate. They retain bicarbonate. Then, active transport pumps in the choroid plexus start pushing that extra bicarbonate into the CSF. They buffer the acid. The CSF pH returns towards normal even though the CO2 is still high. The central drive effectively turns off.
Which leads us to the peripheral chemoreceptors, the carotid and aortic bodies.
The first responders. They're incredibly fast.
Yeah.
They sit right on the carotid artery, tasting fresh arterial blood second by second.
And they care about oxygen, right? That's their main job.
Primarily, yes. They start screaming when the PO2 drops below 60 mmHg. That's their main trigger.
Yeah.
But they also respond to rapid changes in PeCO2 and pH. They are the emergency backup system.
And Miller has a pretty stark warning here about anesthetics and these peripheral sensors.
A very important one. Even tiny doses of volatile agents, we're talking 0.1 MSE, can completely knock out the peripheral response to hypoxia.
Wow.
This is why a patient in the PACU might be satting at 85% and just lying there comfortably not breathing any faster. Their alarm system has been silenced.
Let's draw the second graph then, the ventilatory response curve. X-axis is PeCO2, Y-axis is minute ventilation in liters per minute.
And it looks like a hockey stick. A line going up with a sharp bend at the bottom.
Okay, the handle of the stick is the response line. In a normal, awake person, how steep is that line?
Very steep. For every 1 millimeter of mercury rise in CO2, your minute ventilation goes up by 2 to 3 liters per minute.
3 liters per minute? That's almost doubling your resting breathing for a tiny, tiny change in CO2.
It is a hair trigger system. That's why your CO2 is always right around 40 mmHg. The controller just doesn't tolerate deviation.
But then we have the apneic threshold, the blade of the hockey stick.
This is the PaCO2 level below which all spontaneous ventilation ceases. In an awake person, you can't really reach it easily because your behavioral drive, your consciousness, keeps you breathing. But under anesthesia, if you hyperventilate a patient down to a CO2 of, say, 30 or 32, they will stop breathing. They have crossed the apneic threshold.
Which brings us perfectly to Part D factors affecting the ventilatory response. Specifically, anesthetic agents. This has to be an exam favorite. How do our drugs break this beautifully sensitive curve?
They attack it with a two-hit mechanism. Hit number 1 is a right shift. Hit number 2 is a decreased slope.
Let's define those. Right shifts means what exactly?
The set point moves. Instead of defending a CO2 of 40, the brain says, 50 is fine. The apneic threshold increases. You need more CO2 to trigger a breath.
And decreased slope.
That's a loss of sensitivity. Even when the patient does finally start to breathe, they don't respond vigorously. Instead of that 3 liter per minute increase, you might only get half a liter per minute. The system becomes lazy and sluggish.
Let's break it down by agent. Volatiles. Halothane, sevoflurane, dysflurane.
Miller and Morgan both agree. It is a potent dose-dependent depression. At 1 MAC, the minimum alveolar concentration, you get a significant rise in the resting PaCO2. They shift the curve to the right and they flatten the slope. They also increase that apneic threshold. You have to let the CO2 climb higher and higher to get them to breathe again.
Okay, what about opioids?
Opioids are the classic right shift agents. The interesting thing is, with a pure opioid, the slope might remain relatively normal, or at least less affected than with volatiles.
Really? So if they do breathe, they can breathe effectively?
Potentially, yes. But the threshold to trigger that breath is pushed way, way to the right. The patient simply forgets to breathe. They might sit there with a CO2 of 60 mmHg and feel perfectly comfortable, but if you command them, take a deep breath, they can often do it.
Whereas with the volatiles, the drive itself, the sensitivity, is blunted.
Correct. The engine is weaker. With opioids, the driver is asleep at the wheel.
What about benzodiazepines?
On their own, they cause a mild depression. But the real danger is when you combine them with opioids. You get a profound synergistic depression. The slope drops off a cliff. This is the danger zone in the PACU.
Let's talk about patient factors. What about sleep?
Sleep is essentially a natural anesthetic. It causes a rightward shift. Interestingly, during NREM sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep, our breathing is almost entirely metabolic driven purely by CO2. If you hyperventilate someone just as they fall asleep, they'll have these long apneas until their CO2 builds back up to the new higher threshold.
And COPD, the CO2 retainer. We have to address the elephant in the room, the hypoxic drive myth.
Oh, the bane of physiology professors everywhere.
The story always goes, COPD patients rely on low oxygen to breathe. If you give them oxygen, they will stop breathing and die. True or false?
Mostly false, or at least dangerously incomplete.
Okay, explain.
When you give supplemental oxygen to a chronic CO2 retainer, their CO2 does rise. That part is true. But Miller and other modern texts argue that it's not primarily because their respiratory center just shut down.
So what is it then?
There are two major mechanisms at play. One, the Haldane effect, which we just discussed.
Right.
You flood the blood with oxygen, the hemoglobin becomes oxygenated, it then dumps its CO2 load right into the plasma. So the PaO-P2 rises simply because the transport system unloaded it into the wrong place.
And a second mechanism.
VQ mismatch. In a COPD lung, The body has cleverly used hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, HPV, to shunt blood away from the worst, most poorly ventilated lung units. When you give high-flow oxygen, you abolish that protective vasoconstriction. You release it. Now blood flows to these useless parts of the lung. Your physiological dead space increases dramatically.
So it's a mechanics issue with Haldane and a plumbing issue with VQ mismatch, not just a brain issue.
Exactly. So the clinical takeaway is never, ever withhold oxygen from a hypoxic patient because you are afraid of knocking out their drive. Manage the airway, monitor the CO₂, be prepared to assist ventilation, but do not let them die of hypoxia.
That is a gold medal distinction. Knowing the Haldane and VQ contribution to the so-called oxygen paradox.
It is. What about metabolic factors?
Well, metabolic acidosis stimulates the chemoreceptors. You get that classic Kussmaul breathing. The curve shifts to the left. The body is desperately trying to blow off CO₂ to fix the pH.
And surgical stress.
Pain and stress shift the curve to the left. They stimulate breathing. That's why a patient in agony might be breathing fast, even if their CO₂ is low.
Good. Let's move to Part E, clinical and anesthetic correlation. Intraoperative implications. Laparoscopy.
A huge topic. You are insufflating the abdomen with CO₂. Yao and Artuzio describes this as creating a massive buffer store load.
And why do we use CO₂? Why not just air?
Because CO₂ is highly soluble in blood. If you get a gas embolism with CO₂, it dissolves and is buffered away pretty quickly. If you used room air, which is mostly nitrogen, you'd have a fatal gas lock in the right ventricle.
But the downside of that solubility is absorption.
Yes. The CO₂ is absorbed across the peritoneum. This depends on the intra-abdominal pressure and the tissue solubility. This absorption can completely overwhelm spontaneous ventilation. If you try to let a patient breathe on their own during a long pneumoperitoneum, they will develop a severe respiratory acidosis. You almost always need controlled ventilation.
We monitor this with capnography, but there's a gap there, isn't there? The monitor isn't telling the whole story.
The ED-CO₂ to PaCO₂ gap. Normally, arterial CO₂ is about 2 to 5 mmHg higher than the end-tidal CO₂ we measure.
Because of alveolar dead space.
Right. Some alveoli are ventilated but not perfused, but in laparoscopy, or with a pulmonary embolism, or in profound hypotension, that gap widens. You might see an state CO₂ of 35 on the monitor, but the actual arterial CO₂ could be 50 or even 60.
So Miller reminds us not to trust the monitor blindly in sick patients or in situations with high VQ mismatch.
You always have to check a blood gas if there is a big discrepancy or any hemodynamic instability.
And what about the post-op period? Let's talk about CO₂ narcosis.
This is a really scary spiral. Morgan warns that extremely high PaCO₂, we are talking over 90 or 100 millimeters of mercury, acts as an anesthetic itself.
It makes you sleepy.
Which makes you breathe less, which raises the CO₂ even more, which makes you even sleepier. It's a positive feedback loop of doom that leads to unconsciousness and respiratory arrest.
And weaning from the ventilator.
When we do a T-piece trial or a spontaneous breathing trial, we are essentially testing the position and slope of the patient's CO₂ response curve. If the curve is still shifted way to the right because of residual sedation or opioids, their PaCO₂ will just climb, and they will fail the trial.
And then there's the concept of permissive hypercapnia.
Right, a key concept from O's ICU. In severe ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, trying to blow off CO₂ to normal levels requires really high pressures and volumes that can damage the lungs' volutrauma and barotrauma.
So we compromise.
Exactly. We accept a shift to the right. We tolerate a pH of maybe 7.2, 7.25, and a high CO₂ to protect the lung tissue from the ventilator.
We are prioritizing lung protection over perfect blood gas numbers.
Precisely. It's a trade-off.
Okay, a few special clinical situations. Malignant hyperthermia.
Morgan flags this as critical. If you see an unexplained, rapid, and sustained rise in ED-CO₂ during an anesthetic, you must assume it is malignant hyperthermia until proven otherwise.
Because it's not a ventilation issue, it's a production issue.
Exactly. The body's metabolism has gone into overdrive. It's producing CO₂ so fast you can't possibly ventilate it away. It is often the very first sign, even before the temperature starts to rise.
And neurosurgery.
This is all about CO₂ reactivity. The blood vessels in the brain are incredibly sensitive to CO₂. Hyperventilation lowers the CO₂, which causes vasoconstriction, and that lowers the intracranial pressure, the ICP.
But there's a danger there.
A huge danger. If you clamp down on the vessels too much, you cause ischemia. You can starve the brain of oxygen. So we are always looking for a Goldilocks zone, usually a low normal PaCO2, around 30 to 35 mmHg, but not much lower unless it's an acute herniation crisis.
Okay, we're in the home stretch now. Part F exam integration. Let's do some rapid-fire comparison tables. This is very high yield for the Viva.
Let's do it. Comparison number 1, O2 dissociation curve versus the CO2 dissociation curve.
Okay, shape. O2 is sigmoid, CO2 is linear. Effect. O2 has the Bohr effect, meaning CO2 affects O2 binding. CO2 has the Haldane effect, meaning O2 affects CO2 binding. Stores. O2 stores are small, 1.5 liters. CO2 stores are massive, 120 liters.
Perfect. Comparison 2, central versus peripheral chemoreceptors.
Stimulus. Central detects H+, but indirectly from CO2. Peripheral primarily detects low O2, below 60 mmHg speed. Central is slower, more sustained. Peripheral is fast, immediate. Role. Central is the main day-to-day controller. Peripheral is the emergency responder, the alarm system.
Now let's talk about the traps. Where do candidates consistently fail?
The biggest trap by far is confusing Bohr and Haldane. Just burn the mnemonic into your brain. H for Haldane is hemoglobin holding CO2. Another huge trap is the apneic threshold. The examiner asks, what happens to the apneic threshold with 10 milligrams of morphine?
And the wrong answer is it goes down.
The wrong answer is it goes down. The right answer is it increases. It moves to the right. You need more CO2 to trigger a breath. The patient becomes tolerant of higher CO2 levels.
And the drawing trap.
Do not draw the CO2 curve as a sigmoid. I can't say it enough. Draw it as a straight line. And clearly mark the difference between the arterial and venous points. If you can show the Haldane shift on that graph drawing, 2 parallel lines, one for oxygenated blood and one for deoxygenated blood, you are getting full marks.
Before we wrap up, give me the model conclusion. If the examiner says, okay, summarize CO2 physiology for me in 30 seconds, what is the polished, confident answer?
You look them right in the eye and you say, in summary, CO2 homeostasis is a delicate balance of metabolic production and alveolar ventilation, which is tightly regulated by central and peripheral chemoreceptors. Transport relies heavily on the bicarbonate system and the linear nature of the dissociation curve, with the Haldane effect doubling its efficiency. Anesthesia profoundly disrupts this by altering both the set point and the sensitivity of the respiratory center, necessitating careful monitoring of the CO2 dissociation relationship to ensure patient safety.
Boom. Mic drop.
That is the pass. In fact, that is the gold medal.
This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. We've gone from the basic chemistry inside a single red blood cell all the way to the complex management of a neurosurgical patient.
It is a dense topic, there's no doubt. But once you see the logic, the sheer efficiency of the design, it becomes much easier to remember and to explain.
To all our listeners who are prepping for the Gujarat University exams, or really any anesthesia exam out there, good luck. Go draw those curves.
Best of luck. You have the knowledge. Now go and demonstrate it with confidence.
And we have one final thought to leave you with. We've spent this whole time talking about CO2 as a waste product. But Miller poses an interesting question. Is permissive hypercapnia actually protective beyond just saving the lungs from pressure? Could CO2 be an antioxidant?
There is some evidence it might be. It might scavenge free radicals. We spend our entire careers trying to get rid of it. But maybe, just maybe, a little bit of extra CO2 is exactly what the stressed body needs in certain situations.
Something to think about. Until next time on The Deep Dive.